Welcome to G.I.Joe on the Tabletop. My name is Brad, aka Old Man Morin from the Cast Ice Podcast Network. Now, Cast Ice has been running for quite a while, and it is a podcast that explores the great big wild world of tabletop wargaming, board gaming, and all sorts of gaming, as long as it's interacting with another human being across the tabletop. Now, this is a video series that will be focusing on one of the things that I'm very passionate about and sort of have been my whole life, and that is G.I. Joe. Now, there are a ton of really fantastic content creators for the G.I. Joe community over the years that talk about the toys, of course, the comics, the movies, just the cartoons. There's just so many different voices talking about G.I. Joe, and I thought, given the scope of my hobby projects that are going on right now, that it might be a good idea for me to record some of my progress and to talk about some of my passions as well. Now, if you are not a wargamer, are you going to get something out of this? I hope so. I'm going to be talking a lot about G.I. Joe lore, characters, vehicles from the comic books, from the cartoons, but mainly the comic books. And we're going to be talking about how G.I. Joe sort of was important to me as a kid, but also how we can take G.I. Joe and take toys that, were the toys from our childhood and shrink them down into usable scale models. Now, a large part of my discussions will be, and of course here is a winter worn Mauler that, whose paint is starting to come off, and you can see the original Mauler paint scheme underneath. This is a 3D printed model that I had printed into resin, customized, and then painted myself. And I will be talking more about vehicles like that in a minute. But a lot of the decisions about the modeling that I've been doing revolve around the lore from the comic books, from everything that we know as G.I. Joe, and that will be part of the conversation. Now, I should say right up front, I am not a scale modeler. I am not into a ton of the intricate detailing that some of those modelers are. That said, I am a very experienced wargamer and wargame modeler, and I like to think that I have something that's worth showing. So without further ado, I think maybe we should talk a little bit about my background as a fan of G.I. Joe. Now, way back when I was a kid, I must have been 7, because it was 1982, I went to Toys R Us, like all good kids in the United States at that point, looking for a toy to take home, and I turned a corner and I found a wall of G.I. Joe. And I was blown away at first sight. The colors, the action figures, the vehicles, though at the time it was very limited compared to what we would know later, it was just enormous to me, and I absolutely loved it. And on the bookend was a double-sized issue of G.I. Joe #1, as you can see here. I loved it. And that day, the only thing that I was able to get was an action figure. I believe I got Grunt, and I also got G.I. Joe #1, which of course was written by the great Larry Hamill. Now, massive fan of this comic as a kid, and I read it cover to cover. And it was a double-sized issue, so it was like A3. And I actually have it tucked into one of my shelves at the moment, and I will have to pull it out on a future episode. It is completely worn through, but I absolutely loved it, and I read it, and from that point forward, sort of every job I did around the house, I basically begged, borrowed, and stole as much money as I could from my parents to buy as many G.I. Joes as I could, and from that point forward, I had quite a lot. And I was an avid G.I. Joe collector as a kid, although as a kid, I was just a guy who loved G.I. Joe and had a lot of those toys. It wasn't that I was necessarily collecting, but as an adult, I can look back at my collection, which is still at my parents' house, and think, my God, how did I get all that? But it wasn't until the mid-teens that I started reading the comic books in earnest. It was about the same time that one of my favorite characters, Destro, wasn't sort of introduced, that all of a sudden G.I. Joe became more to me. It wasn't just toys. And I think that was about, I mean, it makes sense. In when I was 7, I must have been, what, in first grade? I wouldn't have understood it as well. But as we got into the teens, I was a couple years older. I was starting to read game books. And so for me, the stories that were told, especially in that sweet run of sort of the mid-teens through 50 issue 50 or 60 of the G.I. Joe comic run, the original A Real American Hero run, they were just fantastic, and I absolutely loved them. Now I did put in Hot Potato, which is the back of the first issue, and which hasn't always been repressed in some of the trade paperbacks. One of the reasons why though I have a ton of G.I. Joe comics, I collected up through issue in the mid-'80s. This is the one that moved with me. I am an American, but I grew up overseas and traveling, and these days I live in Melbourne, Australia. So the only G.I. Joe comic that lives with me is, of course, issue 1, because it has Hot Potato, which is one of my favorite comic shorts of all time. I absolutely love. It's got some of my favorite G.I. Joe characters: Snake Eyes, Rock and Roll, Scarlet. I know they're fan favorites, but I absolutely loved it, and I'm glad they were in that issue, and I have it here because I do have a ton of the trades that I'm able to travel with more easily now than the stacks of original comic books, which are all bagged and boarded back at my parents' house. I'm not sure exactly why they're bagged and boarded. Like the toys, I read them and played with, I played the toys to death, and I read the comics till they were almost falling apart, and I traveled with them around the world, so they are in rough shape, but I guess I do want them to survive into later years where I can go back and revisit those issues. Anyway, moving on. One of the things that I absolutely will be talking a lot about on the series is the blueprints, because a lot of what makes the G.I. Joe vehicles what they are is, I guess, their design, all the detail that goes into them. I mean, one only needs to look at the original G.I. Joe base and those little platforms that rise up that the vehicles can sit on, and consider that there were pegs on there for the HAL, for the MMS, for the flak. There were spaces for the tires, for the vamp, for the snowmobile, for the Mobat. I mean, the absolute eye for detail that went into these toys was fantastic, and that's a lot of kind of what I want to bring to these videos, is how I took the detailing from the toys and to put them specifically into tabletop models that we can play games with. For example, a His Tank. Now, this is a running press toy that I have cut apart and rebuilt and used some, technical paints and some detailing paint to create a 1/56 scale His Tank. And I will be talking about how I did that in a future video. But, some of the other vehicles that I've been working on, now these are 1/56 scale. So that is a bolt action themed, or a bolt action Warlord Games Sherman tank. Now, bolt action is a game that I'm extremely passionate about. I've been podcasting about for years, and it will be sort of the vehicle that I use for the fuel for this video series, I guess, because I am painting for a bolt action tournament that's coming up on Easter weekend, and so I will be painting a lot of G.I. Joes between now and then. Now, over the last couple of years, I've been slowly dripping out and working through a number of G.I. Joe vehicles. I guess because one of the vehicles I wanted to paint most right off the bat was the Snowcat. I have winterized most of my G.I. Joe vehicles, as you can probably tell from what I've been showing so far. So here you have a couple of APCs, and I put them next to a Sherman so you get an idea of scale. When I get these vehicles, they do come, I have had them printed in 1/56 scale roughly in resin. There are quite a few G.I. Joe vehicles on Thingiverse that can be printed off. There's other alternate manufacturers. I'll be talking about some of those in future videos. and where I get some of the stuff that I am building and painting, and maybe some of the paints that I use along the way. As you can see, I do have quite a few of these vehicles. This is just a random shot of my scrubbing table where I had models drying after I washed them with warm water and a toothbrush to remove all the mold release agents and all the residue left over from the 3D printing process. But if you want an idea of the scale comparison between these vehicles that I am making and the actual G.I. Joe vehicles, well, there you have it. Here are 3 vamps from my collection at home and 3 corresponding vehicles. There's a Stinger on there, of course, and 2 Stingers actually, and a fan-created vamp truck. Now, I will be spending quite a lot of time on this series, bringing everything together so that fans of the comics, people who love the toys, will get something out of these videos as well. But just right off the bat, I wanted to introduce myself and talk a little bit about what I was going to be doing and why I was going to be doing that. Now, at the end of these videos, I will be talking about how to represent these vehicles on the tabletop, specifically usually in reference to bolt action, although I will be talking about games like 7TV and other tabletop skirmish and war games on top of that. But expect a good bit of lore, expect some of the stats and technical details for each vehicle, maybe even some of the design concepts. I'm a big fan of Ron Rudat's work, obviously, as a big fan of G.I. Joe vehicles, and has he designed a lot of the greats. I will be talking a lot about that as well. And I'll be talking about how I built and converted these vehicles to best make them represent the vehicles that I know and love from my childhood. I hope this has been informative. I hope you do check in with future vehicles when I actually get into specifics and start talking about specific vehicles. I just wanted to introduce the series to start with. I am relatively new to YouTube. If you have any suggestions on how I can make these videos better, please do leave a comment below. And I'd love it if you subscribed and checked out the vehicle profiles. And I will be doing character profiles as well. I am currently building and converting a bunch of infantry right now. I built Snake Eyes last night, in fact. Very excited about that. And I can't wait to paint them up and show you soon. Without further ado, this is Brad signing out from the Cast Dice Network, saying I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you come back and check us out. Have a nice day.